I wasn't looking for buried cities when I started photographing historic buildings. I was documenting architectural preservation, the kind of straightforward work that involves measuring facades, cataloguing decorative elements, and noting structural deterioration. Standard archival photography. But then I noticed something that made no sense. The windows were wrong. Not damaged, not renovated. Wrong. Ground-level windows on buildings across multiple cities converted into basement ventilation grades. Ornate entranceways, clearly designed as grand main doors, now sitting 3 to 5 feet below current street level, accessible only by descending concrete stairs that looked obviously retrofitted. Elaborate stonework and decorative friezes positioned at what should be eye level, now at ankle height, half buried in sidewalks that seemed to have been poured directly over them. These weren't isolated cases. Building after building, city after city, the same pattern. The first floor wasn't the first floor anymore. It was underground. The official explanation comes quickly and confidently. Urban fill. Cities raised their street levels over time to improve drainage, accommodate new utilities, bury old infrastructure. Perfectly reasonable. Happens everywhere. Except when you actually examine a timeline, when you measure the depth, when you compare the architectural consistency across thousands of miles. The official explanation begins to collapse under its own weight. I started in Seattle. The Seattle Underground is famous, almost touristy. Everyone knows the story. After the Great Fire of 1889, the city rebuilt at a higher elevation to solve flooding problems. The old street level became basements and tunnels. Simple, documented, explained. But here's what they don't emphasize. The raising wasn't gradual. It wasn't incremental infrastructure improvement spread over decades. It happened in a single event, a coordinated effort that buried entire city blocks under 8 to 12 feet of fill material in less than 10 years. That's not normal urban development. That's crisis response. And Seattle isn't unique. I found the same pattern in Chicago. After the 1871 fire, the city raised street levels by 4 to 14 feet across massive sections of downtown. Official records frame this as progressive engineering, solving drainage issues and creating space for new utilities. But photographs from the 1870s and 1880s show something else entirely. They show buildings whose ground floors have become basements, whose main entrances have been buried, whose windows now open onto underground spaces that were clearly never designed for that purpose. In Galveston, Texas, after the 1900 hurricane, the entire city was raised by raising over 5 million cubic yards of sand dredged from the Gulf of Mexico. Every building, every street elevated by as much as 17 feet. The official narrative credits this to flood prevention, to protecting against future hurricanes. But here's the question nobody asks. Where did all the buried buildings go? What happened to the first floors of thousands of structures that suddenly found themselves underground? The answer, according to official records, is that they were simply repurposed, turned into basements, filled in, forgotten, as if burying functional architecture is a normal solution to flooding, as if it's standard practice to leave ornate doorways and decorated windows underground where nobody will see them. But it's not just American cities. The pattern appears globally with suspicious consistency. In Edinburgh, Scotland, entire streets from the 1700s sit buried beneath the modern city. Mary King's Close, one of many underground thoroughfares, preserves multiple levels of buried buildings, complete with shops, homes, and public spaces that were functioning at street level before being covered over. The official explanation involves bridge construction and urban expansion, but the archaeological evidence shows something different. It shows sudden burial, rapid covering, as if the old street level became unlivable or inaccessible all at once. In Rome, the street level has risen approximately 20 feet since ancient times. Every tourist who visits the Roman Forum walks on surfaces that sit meters above the original ground level. Archaeologists carefully excavate to reveal the true first floors of ancient structures, always finding them buried under layers of soil and debris. We accept this for ancient Rome because centuries of accumulated sediment seems plausible over 2,000 years, but the same pattern appears in cities only 200 or 300 years old. The timeline doesn't work. In Savannah, Georgia, nearly every historic building has a buried first floor, basements that were clearly designed as ground-level spaces, windows too ornate for underground rooms, doorways facing buried streets. The city attributes this to raising the riverfront and systematically elevating streets throughout the 1800s. But the architectural evidence tells a different story. These spaces weren't built to be basements. They were built as primary floors with natural lighting, grand entrances, and public-facing facades. Then something happened, and they were buried. I started measuring. Not casually, systematically. I documented the depth of burial across multiple cities, multiple countries, multiple continents, and a pattern emerged that the official explanations can't account for. The depth is consistent, not identical, but clustered. Most buildings are buried between 4 and 12 feet, not 2 feet, not 20 feet. 4 to 12 feet regardless of whether you're in Seattle or Savannah, Edinburgh or Galveston, Chicago or Rome. As if whatever caused the burial happened at a similar scale globally. And then there's the timeline. The vast majority of documented street raising, filling and burial events clustered between 1850 and 1920. Not gradually over centuries, but concentrated in a 70-year window. The same 70 years when Tartaria disappears from maps, the same 70 years when photographs of giants stop appearing, the same 70 years when newspaper reports of advanced pre-industrial technology cease being published. Not coincidence. Pattern. The mud itself tells a story nobody wants to examine. When cities claim they raise street levels using fill material, the official records describe graded construction, controlled placement of soil and rubble, engineered foundations for new infrastructure. But when you actually examine the buried layers, when you look at geological surveys and construction excavations, you find something else entirely. You find mud. Not compacted fill, not engineered soil, not construction debris, mud. Fine-grained sediment consistent with catastrophic flooding or liquefaction events. In construction sites across San Francisco, workers regularly uncover preserved wooden structures from the 1800s, buried under layers of sediment that show clear signs of water deposition. The wood is often pristine, protected by the anaerobic conditions created by sudden, complete burial in waterlogged soil, not the gradual accumulation you'd expect from incremental street raising. Sudden inundation. The same pattern appears in excavations across Chicago, where foundation work constantly reveals buried storefronts, sidewalks, and street-level infrastructure under layers of sediment that show laminar flow patterns. Layers that look like they were deposited by moving water, not placed by construction crews, but questioning this leads nowhere. The official records are clear. These cities raised their streets. End of discussion. Except the buildings themselves contradict that narrative. Because if you were raising street levels intentionally, if you were conducting planned urban improvement projects, you would adapt your architecture accordingly. You would design buildings for the new street level, not bury perfectly functional first floors and call them basements. But that's not what happened. Instead, we find buildings where the decorative elements, the architectural focal points, the design emphasis, all occurs on what is now the underground level. Main entrances with elaborate stonework, now buried. Large windows with ornate frames, now ventilation grates, cornices and friezes positioned at what should be eye level, now underground. These buildings were clearly designed for the buried street level. They were built to be viewed from the old surface, not the new one, and then retrofitted, hastily adapted when that surface disappeared. I started documenting doorways. Across dozens of cities, I photographed entrances that made no functional sense. Grand doorways positioned below modern street level, accessible only by descending staircases that cut through sidewalks in ways that disrupt pedestrian flow and create obvious structural complications. These staircases aren't original features, they're retrofits, added after the fact to provide access to entrances that were designed to open at ground level. But here's what disturbs me most. Many of these buried entrances are no longer used. They've been sealed, filled in, or converted to basement access points. And nobody questions why. Why would you build elaborate main entrances with decorative stonework, classical columns, and architectural emphasis, then bury them and cut new doors into upper floors? Why would you design buildings with specific sight lines and proportional relationships to street level, then raise the street and destroy those relationships? Unless you didn't choose to raise the street, unless something else happened and the street raising was crisis response, not planned development. The photographic evidence is impossible to dismiss. Images from the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s show buildings at their original street level before the burial. These aren't reconstructions or artistic renderings, they're photographs, actual documentary evidence showing buildings whose ground floors align with the street, whose windows open to air and light, whose entrances sit at grade level exactly as the architects intended. Then, photographs from the 1890s and early 1900s show the same buildings with raised streets, buried first floors, and retrofitted access. The transition is visible, documented, undeniable. But the explanation for why this happened across multiple cities, multiple countries, within the same concentrated time period, remains unconvincing. What if something occurred on a scale we're not supposed to consider? What if a global event, a catastrophic mud flood, buried the first floors of buildings across multiple continents simultaneously? What if the Tartarian civilization, whatever it actually was, experienced a cataclysm that inundated cities with meters of mud and sediment in a single event or series of related events? It would explain the consistency. Why the depth of burial clusters between 4 and 12 feet globally? Why the timeline concentrates in the same 70-year period? Why the architectural evidence shows sudden adaptation rather than planned development? Why photographs document rapid transformation rather than gradual change? It would explain the mud. Why excavations reveal sediment layers consistent with water deposition rather than engineered fill? Why buried structures show signs of sudden inundation rather than controlled burial? Why the geological evidence contradicts the official construction narratives? And it would explain the silence. Because acknowledging a global mud flood event in the mid-1800s requires acknowledging that recent history isn't what we've been taught, that a civilization existed, was buried, and was systematically erased from official records, that we're living in cities built on top of something we don't understand, using infrastructure we didn't create, inhabiting structures we've simply adapted and claimed as our own. The basement windows haunt me most, ornate ironwork framing what are now below-grade openings. Decorative elements that make no sense for basement ventilation, but make perfect sense for street-level display. Windows designed to be seen, to contribute to the building's facade, to create visual rhythm along a public thoroughfare. Now buried, their purpose erased, their design reduced to utilitarian function. Walk through any historic district, look at the buildings, really look at them. Notice where the decorative emphasis occurs. Notice where the architectural detail concentrates. Notice where the proportions and sightlines are designed to be viewed from. Then notice the current street level. Notice how often they don't align. Notice how often the beauty sits underground, visible only if you descend those retrofitted staircases, only if you question why basements have ornate windows and elaborate stonework. The pattern repeats in city after city. Portland, Oregon. Buried first floors beneath raised streets. Old Town Alexandria, Virginia. Underground levels that were clearly designed as ground floors. Victoria, British Columbia. Sidewalks poured over windows and doorways. Montreal, Quebec. Entire commercial districts where businesses operate from what were originally second floors, while the first floors remain buried and repurposed. This isn't normal urban development. This is crisis adaptation. This is civilization rebuilding after catastrophe, adapting what remains and constructing a narrative that explains the adaptation without acknowledging the catastrophe. And when you mention this, when you point out the architectural inconsistencies, the geological evidence, the photographic documentation, the concentrated timeline, you're met with the same dismissive response. Urban development, street raising, infrastructure improvement. As if those explanations actually address the evidence, as if saying the words makes the questions disappear. But the questions don't disappear. They accumulate. Why does every major city have buried architecture? Why do the burial depths cluster so consistently? Why does the timeline concentrate so dramatically? Why do geological surveys show sediment patterns inconsistent with engineered fill? Why do photographs document such rapid transformation? Why does nobody ask these questions officially? The mudflood layer exists. It's measurable, documentable, visible in every excavation, every construction project, every archaeological survey. 4 to 12 feet of sediment separating our current street level from the original ground floor of buildings across the globe. Sediment deposited rapidly, burying functional architecture, forcing adaptation and reconstruction. We walk over it daily without acknowledgement. We build on top of it without examination. We accept the official explanations without investigating whether they actually explain anything. Because investigating requires accepting that something massive happened, something that buried cities, destroyed infrastructure, and necessitated a coordinated global response that we've reframed as progressive urban development. The buildings remember, even if we've chosen to forget. The buried windows still look out on darkness. The sealed doorways still wait for visitors who will never arrive. The ornate first floors still exist, preserved under our sidewalks, protected by the very sediment that destroyed them. And somewhere in the official records, someone made a decision, decided that explaining the mud flood was less important than moving forward, decided that questioning the catastrophe was less productive than accepting the new street level, decided that we would inherit these buildings, adapt them, use them, and never ask who built them or why they're buried. The evidence persists, the mud flood layer remains, and every basement window that was clearly designed for natural light, every buried doorway that was obviously meant as a main entrance, every underground floor that was architecturally emphasized as a primary space, stands as silent testimony to the event we've agreed not to discuss. What happened in the mid-1800s? What buried our cities? And what else vanished beneath that mud that we're still pretending was never there at all?